For our COBT listeners and viewers, it's Maynard, Mike, and Arjun here with the kickoff COBT of 2026. We hope everyone had a great holiday season and you're ready for the excitement that is to be 2026. We are doing a tradition here at Veriten, which is in the leadoff hitter slot for the year. We have Rob West. Rob, I think this is the third year we've done this, and you have also now cracked the ranks of you are the most revered, most appearances COBT guest we've had. This is your sixth, and people love it, and we love it, and we love you. So welcome to the show. Welcome to the year. Rob, it's great to have you.
Oh, back at you, and thank you.
Well, look, we're kind of in a lot of places. This show may have the most geographic spread of any get-together we've ever done. I'm in Houston, but headed to the CES conference in Las Vegas to see what's happening in the tech world. Mike and Arjun are in Miami at the Goldman Sachs Energy Conference, which has a full slate of every flavor possible. And Rob is in Estonia. So we have fully half the Earth, at least, covered just in this Zoom call. Mike, why don't you kick us off? You look very debonair, kind of like a Panamanian guy in Miami. What would you tell us about what's happening there? What's happening in the world? Get us started.
Well, Maynard, I took my sunglasses off for this call, so I would look even more debonair if I had them on. But what I'd say is that look, we started out with kind of a bang this year, especially in energy and materials. We all know why that is. It's because of what happened in Venezuela, and I'm sure Arjun's going to talk a little bit more about that. But we're only 3 days in, right, in trading this year. But as far as 2025, the key themes were basically around tech, AI, and electricity. And I think those are going to continue to be the same things in 2026. The question is, will those names outperform or will they underperform? We don't know the answer to that question. But there's a lot in these stocks, so it's going to be very interesting. As far as how 2025 has started out, like I said, we're only 3 days in. Bonds
2026. You just did what I do all the time.
2026. Yes. 2026. I mean, what's happened here, like I said, it's only 3 days in, but energy and materials are material outperformers at this point in time. Telecom and tech are underperforming. What's really interesting, the S&P is up about 1% over the last 3 days, but the Dow is up about 2%. That's because energy stocks, financial stocks, material stocks, they're outperforming. And the names that are basically underperforming are tech and telecom. So that's why the Dow is outperforming. So there seems to be a little bit of a shift, at least early on in this year, to more industrial type names and away from those telecom. But like I said, it's only been 3 days. As far as commodities, crude oil is up about 2%. Natural gas is down between 8 and 9%. And that's just a weather-related call there. And so, as far as the broader markets, like I said, the S&P is up 1%, Dow's down, Dow's up about 2%. And, as far as energy stocks, what's really interesting is on this Venezuelan trade, energy is up around 4%. But what's interesting is oil services are up around 9 or 10%. I looked this morning, Schlumberger is up around 14%, Weatherford 13%. So the big three oil service companies are up more than 10%. That is a huge move in 3 days for those names. You have basically large cap or the oil majors are up anywhere from 4 to 5 to 6%. And you have basically refiners, sort of the big US Gulf Coast refiners are up anywhere from 10 to 14% as well. And the names that are underperforming are E&Ps. And that's really, I think what's happened here is the Venezuelan event took a lot of people by surprise. And I think at least early on, people, and I would say people being hedge funds, were not set up for this trade. There's a bit of a reversal and unwind going on. And so I'd say, let's see where we're at 2 to 3 weeks from now. If these same names continue to outperform, then that would tell me that, sort of more generalist type money is moving into these names for either one or two things. There's going to be more service spending next year. We're seeing that in the Mideast. I think people are starting to jump to conclusion maybe that's going to happen in Venezuela. I'm not so sure I'm there yet, but those names are outperforming. And so, like I said, we'll see the next 2 to 3 weeks how these names perform. Now, what I would say is we're at the Goldman Sachs Energy Conference, and I think the big thing for companies is not only at Venezuela, but we're going into Q4 earnings are going to start happening in the next 30 to 45 days. And so the big issue right now and what investors are trying to hear is what do CapEx budgets look like for 2026? And if you look at the strip between where it is today versus where it was 90 days ago, we're only down about $2 or $3. Is that going to be enough to really change budget thinking from 90 days ago to now? I don't think so, but it's probably not going up. It's probably going to be marginally lower, but I think that's where people are trying to basically get a handle on right now. So that's about it. Like I said, we have a reversal to the mean. It's just a reversion of companies. I think hedge funds were basically caught on the wrong side. We'll see where we are 2 to 3 weeks from now. That's what we're hearing from Miami.
All right. Arjun, it's really cool you guys are there in Miami with so many friends. And special thanks to our friends at Goldman Sachs. They keep inviting us back. They're quite good to us. But what would you share? What's the mood there? Tell us what's on your mind.
Maynard, I'm looking forward to probably a broader energy conversation with our great guest, Rob West, but maybe I will focus on the oil markets, given that that's been the big news here at the start of the year. And I think Mike laid it out really well. There's a lot of hot takes about what's going to happen, what's production going to be, whether it's Venezuela or what that means for other regions or so forth. I think Mike really said it well, which is there's still a lot to be determined about this. It's a dynamic situation. It's very early days. And I think it's premature to jump to any strong conclusions one way or the other on this. And I think we're going to take a little bit of a wait and see attitude. I think you can look at past examples over the last 50 years where you've had meaningful changes in government in various countries, and it would lead you to a more cautious outlook for how quickly countries can recover in terms of production, these kind of things. But the situation is very unique. So it's not obvious that the past situations are good examples or not. And we're going to, as always, keep an open mind and see how things develop. I think this is all, especially in oil markets, been part of this broader, I'll call it consensus narrative, that there's a massive oil glut. And of course, our view has been there is some amount of oversupply, but we've not been in that oil glut kind of camp. I think the oil demand numbers, Rob talked about this in some of his great year-end reports, has been surprising to the upside. There's been this debate between the IEA, which has been quite cautious, and OPEC research, which has been more optimistic. We have leaned directionally towards OPEC research. And I feel like as the numbers are coming in, we're starting to feel confident that in what is still a very sluggish global GDP environment, oil demand looks like it's growing at least 1 million barrels a day, maybe a little bit more than that. And it's not clear when that ends. Do we enter a virtuous cycle where this AI and power boom also leads to overall energy demand use, of which oil is part of it? Does things like China's manufacturing glut and the significant power and cost advantage they have versus the rest of the world, to the extent they're feeling friction from places like the United States and maybe Europe, you're starting to see them, I will say, sell at a low cost, maybe dump is another word people use, some of these renewables and EVs into the rest of Asia and Africa. And that is almost certainly stimulating positive economic growth in those areas. The oil demand numbers, you might think they're in conflict with EV growth. And I would argue it's a virtuous cycle. At least that's the early signs that we're seeing. There's still a lot to be determined. And so this sort of, we're going to need all forms of energy, that not just EVs and renewables are going to grow, but so is a whole bunch of other things I think we're going to get into with Rob. And that also plays into the oil demand numbers. So we've called oil as in a bottoming phase. I think we still feel good about that. Whether it's the second half of this year or 2027, we could probably debate the exact timing of when a stronger recovery might happen. But I feel encouraged that in some of the meetings we've attended, there's been some notion on the part of investors that there is a need again for companies to start thinking about risk in their portfolio, not going crazy, but how do you take a more forward view on energy markets more broadly, but oil specifically. And so maybe I'll leave it there, Maynard, and really looking forward to the discussion today.
That's awesome. Rob, as we jump in with you and just maybe to kind of bridge the conversation around the Goldman Sachs Energy Conference and the kickoff to the year. Arjun, I'm thinking you were there last year. I was there a couple years ago. As you look at the agenda and think about how the menu has changed over the last year or two, my quick take, and please comment, is you see some more nuclear, more standalone nuclear, so less of a concept and more of a specifics. You definitely see more data center related. You see less decarbonization. I feel like you might see a little more Canada, just kind of taking a quick look at it. And then, one thing that's quite interesting is David Solomon's going to interview Chris Wright, which, Chris is a force of nature and his ability to talk about so much of the energy space. But I don't know, any comment from you, Arjun, as you think about the menu and the topics and how things have changed as we jump in with Rob?
I think that's been the big theme across conferences, certainly relative to 2021, which we might call peak the energy transition, to still sort of energy transition, but hey, this Russia-Ukraine things happen, so we have to again care about geopolitical security, to now what has been overwhelmingly a focus on AI and power and these kind of things. And so, we've written, past energy super cycles were at their core oil super cycles, even if other things like copper and steel benefited. And we've seen this go round, we're going to call it a power super cycle. I think that very much plays through in some of these Goldman conference themes. And this is probably personal bias that you're now going to hear, but I'll say the energy conversation is normalized. It's not that there's zero discussion about environmental issues. I was in a conversation with someone asking me about water disposal, as an example. I had another conversation with someone about what does the European CBAM mean? You can have a view on European climate policy. You can have a view on European trade policy, but they have started a CBAM. And if part of the discussion is that, hey, US and Europe, you have all these tough environmental and labor standards. If you're simply going to export your hard industry to China, what does that do for the environment? So we've done tariffs here in the US. They're doing a CBAM. I think this could be an interesting topic of conversation with Rob. So I would just say that it's not that now no one cares about any of these other environmental or other issues. I think they're in their appropriate spot where it's relevant, we talk about it. But at its core, we care about economic growth, we care about jobs, we care about the economy and these kind of things. And I think that's the heart of what energy's always been about. And I think we've gotten back to that, but I'm probably now reflecting as much personal opinion and preference as I am perhaps, observation.
Hey, personal opinion is welcome, particularly from you, Arjun. Yeah. Rob, thank you so much for joining us. One of the highlights of 2025 was you joined Veriten as a senior advisor. So thank you for doing that. We love having you being part of the family. As we think about this year, Thunder said you recently put out a piece, which is the sort of the 2026 10 themes for energy in 2026. We can start anywhere you want. Your pieces are so good. There's lots of them that we could refer to and talk about. But what's the main thing on your mind as here we are, the first full business week of the year? What's the main thing on your mind coming into 2026?
It's how much things have changed from how they were coming into 2024, even more so coming into 2023. It's exactly the point Arjun was developing. I mean, it feels like the momentum, there's always one narrative to rule them all. It's a bit J.R.R. Tolkien, but there's one theme that captivates people more than anything else. And I think it was net zero, definitely 2023. And that shift to the captivation of AI, I mean, I think the best single illustration of it in one example is there's a site in Teesside in the UK where BP was planning to build a blue hydrogen facility, and that got cancelled at the end of last year. And instead, they're thinking about building an AI data center there. Last year in my research, I saw companies talking about stranded assets, and stranded assets are no longer assets that emit CO2 in a world that's rapidly decarbonizing. It's assets that don't adopt generative AI and other AI techniques to bring down their cost on the cost curve. And then at the end of last year, I was looking at vehicle companies, and a third of them have cancelled or scaled back their EV aspirations quite dramatically. But all of them have dialed up their focus on autonomy and enabling people to get in a car and sit back and work or relax or sleep and end up exactly where they want to be. So much that one of these companies is talking about net zero. And it's not net zero of a fleet that emits no CO2. It's a fleet that has zero collisions, zero fatalities, enabled by AI. And so, wherever you look, if there is a thing, it is being reshaped by AI, and that has become the, one ring to rule them all in the big themes of energy markets.
Hey, Rob, one question for you, because obviously Venezuela is on everyone's mind. What's the, this is a ridiculous question, but what is the European reaction here? I can imagine it's all over the map, and I can imagine it's pretty negative in certain places, but pretty dramatic turn of events. What could you share anything on that?
Well, Maynard, I don't speak for Europe. I speak for Rob.
Yes, you do, Rob. We've decided.
I'll tell you Rob's view is that Venezuela is too soon to tell. And Europe, and Europe's reaction, well, I mean, look, I think if it's 2026 and you don't like something and still all you can do is complain about it, that's a pretty poor show. You've got security issues on Europe's doorstep. You've still got, undersea cables in the Baltic Sea miraculously being disconnected, but by a ship. Nobody knows which one, except it was that one. And, if you can't stop these incidents from happening, as they affect you, and you don't have a say in your own geopolitical security, I think that's pretty shabby. And I think it's got to stop. And I think Europe needs to look at how it can have more influence and more autonomy to shape its own future, rather than just complaining about things that happen in the world passively. And I hope that 2026 will be a year where Europe focuses on regaining its ability to be effective rather than simply complain about things.
Well, see, this is, I know when we've talked to you in the past, or whether it's COBT or otherwise, you've talked about how defense and security can become a driver of technology and sort of become an engine, in a weird way, where decarbonization used to be an engine. Now defense is an engine, national security is an engine. And outside of oil production in Venezuela and all sorts of other things that are talked about, the technology and the precision of the U.S. military, it's a pretty impressive feat that took place. And I just sort of wonder, when you think about Europe, Ukraine, technology, defense, improving technologies for the purpose of national security, like, what do you think about that space? Like, whether it's drones, I realize this is a long question. You're going to bail me out of this, Rob, but that piece of the puzzle and the spending and the technologies we might see around national security, what do you think about that piece of the puzzle?
I mean, I think the world is going to end up spending $1 trillion a year more on defense by 2030 than it was doing in 2022. I think the real challenge for Europe is that this defense spending should hopefully also be useful outside of wartime. Things that, like critical infrastructure or developing smart AI within industry, or even smart grids. And for Europe, in some places, continuing to develop renewables. These can be things that support competitiveness and support geopolitical strength, but also have value across the board as well. And so I think it just becomes another lens with which you have to evaluate stuff.
Well, and I also said, it was funny, you said I don't speak for Europe, but we've decided, Rob, you can speak for Europe. Well,
it would be dangerous if I did. I mean, if I did, I would get rid of CBAM. I would get rid of carbon prices. I would not put incentives behind any form of energy that couldn't stand on its feet on its own. I would make the regulation less onerous so that you can build and develop energy and industry within Europe, because otherwise it will all go away. And I think some people, would hear me say that and say, you don't belong in Europe, go back to the States. And some people would say, actually, God, it's quite high time we did some of that in Europe, because otherwise we're going to be in real trouble. And it feels to me like that second category of voices is starting to grow louder and louder. I think there are people here who are just fed up and look at things that are happening in the world where Europe's future is dictated with Europe not in the room, and say, that's a pretty poor show. We need to have a place in the room. And if we can't take a place in the room, we sort of seem to be living in this weird world where if you take it, it's yours. And if you can't stop somebody from taking something that's yours, I think that's a pretty poor show.
Yeah, that's a pretty fascinating comment. I think, Rob, we had just yesterday a European venture capitalist came by, and we found ourselves talking about how misleading it is to use the word Europe, because if you're talking about Finland, Poland, Estonia, there's some attitudes and views. And if you're talking about the UK or France, or where I'm headed here. And so Europe is not, it has a lot of different views in it.
Yeah, but you could say the same thing comparing, Maine and, I don't know, Utah.
Yeah. No, fair enough. Fair enough. All right, I don't know where
Let's
we're
talk
headed
about
with all this,
Maine
Rob.
and Utah and energy in all of these interesting places. I mean, I wanted to dive in more on those kind of big themes that are changing this year. And I think the kind of continuation of what I was saying around it is there is going to be a lot of change. There is going to be a lot of recalibration. Some of the things that were these well like entrenched truths of energy, solar will only ever accelerate. False. Solar will probably be flat this year. EVs will only ever accelerate. False. EVs will probably be down this year compared to last year. LNG will go into big glut of oversupply. False. Actually, I think we're going to end up with LNG markets being pretty tight for a few years. Oil demand will peak. No, we're going to go back to the view that oil will grow 1 million barrels a day per year, every year, because of the things that are changing. And so these perceptions that have just been like defining features of being an energy analyst in the last 3 to 5 years, I think a lot of them are going to break down. And you've touched on some of those for Europe and geopolitics. And I think finally, like a lot of these things are at breaking point this year, and we can talk about why, and we can talk about what it means.
Let's jump in on some of those, and then Mike and Arjun, we got to get you guys in here. But so you hit a couple, solar flattening and EVs flattening to maybe going down. The one you talked about, I saw Arjun's eyebrows buck a little bit. LNG, and this. Do you mind if we just start there and global gas and global supply and demand and kind of what you're thinking about there?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there is a wave of new supply getting built. That's kind of undeniable. And the numbers for that, we might have had 10 to 15 million tons a year of growth in the last, each year in the last, say, 4 to 5 years. We go to 25 to 30 million tons a year of growth this year, next year, and then 50 million tons a year of growth in 27, 28, through to 32. And that's why people are saying, we're looking down the barrel of a huge wave of oversupply coming on. And I think that the things I'd push back on that are that, I have this big LNG project tracker file that I update every 6 months. It takes like a week to update it. And every time I do, every year, 40% of the projects get delayed and moved back. And so, you do the update on all these projects getting built over the last year, and they've moved to the right, and they always move to the right. And that keeps 26 a little bit tighter. Then you have this theme of natural gas in the US. So I think shale is going to decline by about 700,000 barrels a day in 2026 because of oil prices being low, possibly being even lower. And as a result, associated gas is going to decline by about 2 BCF a day. And as a result, the gas that feeds, the LNG, remember, US LNG is half of the growth between now and 2030. And the gas that, gets to do that, especially in 2026 and 2027, is going to have to be, it's not associated gas that you get for free, but it's going to be Haynesville gas, marginal Haynesville gas. So that's probably around $4.50, just to produce that gas. And then by the time you get it to the Gulf Coast, liquefy it, ship it to Europe, the total cost of that gas is somewhere around $10 an MCF. So you might add that supply into the market, but the price has to stay above around 10 for that to actually all come online. And then you have these little pockets of just concern. For example, if you look at Russia, from 2027, Europe will no longer allow Russia to transship gas from Russia, like from the Arctic LNG projects, the Yamal Peninsula, through Europe. And so you've already started seeing the start of that. And you've already started seeing some like totally crazy things Russia is having to do to try and get its gas to market. We're talking about like 35 million tons a year here. Like there was a tanker, an LNG tanker that went, past my house. It went from the Baltic port all the way around to China. That's like a 15,000-mile nautical journey. And it got sold at a 40% discount because nobody else would take the gas. And so I think from 27, you'll start to see some of that Russian gas failing to find a route to market and getting shut in. And then you have three areas in particular, which historically were massive LNG exporters, and their internal gas demand is going gangbusters. And as a result, they're actually going to become net LNG importers. The LNG they make is going to get routed to their own domestic market if they continue making it at all. And even then, they're still going to be importing more LNG than they themselves produce. So I'm talking about Malaysia, Indonesia, and Egypt has had this huge issue where the Zohr field that was meant to make Egypt's LNG plants come back to full capacity has kind of disappointed, and now Egypt is out tendering for like 100 LNG cargoes for this summer and next. So just to sum it all up, supply growth is hard. It always takes longer. There's always more issues, and that's why I think actually this LNG glut, we're going to build a lot, but it might not create a glut in the market.
So does that mean you're saying, Rob, that a lot of that capital that will go into LNG expansion is not going to do well? Because
no, I think it's going to do great. It's going to do just fine. I think there are people who are worried that the capital is going to go in and it's all going to get written off. But I think you build that LNG capacity, and we are going to need that capacity. And I actually think there are a lot of people who want to get really depressed over this space, but I'm not one of them.
Just while we're on LNG, Australia, it's an interesting market. And do you mind just commenting on that?
There was another area where there was news last year. There's about 20 million tons of LNG coming out of Queensland, QCLNG, GLNG, APLNG, and Australia has like a real domestic gas shortage. And so they have allocated 15 to 25% of that Queensland gas is now not available for export, and it has to be sent to the domestic market. So there's some question marks there about whether that is going to impact the ability to run those big three facilities, and indeed whether there will be good or bad long-term implications of countries saying, hey, we need to bring down domestic prices, so we're not allowed to export as much. And I'm sure everybody will have a view on whether that is going to create more or less supply of energy over the long run.
Yeah, Rob, it's really interesting. You're reporting the 10 themes for energy in 2026. Awesome report, loved it. I guess my question for you is, you've hit on a couple points already, but I'm going to look at it more from a client investor standpoint. What are the main topics that really kind of piqued their interest that you've heard back in the last 2 or 3 days from them, and maybe where was that interest 6 months ago from those clients?
Well, I think it's really on this theme about what if we're in a world where oil demand keeps growing? There are a lot of things, in that kind of broad equity landscape that were in, sail off into the sunset valuation territory. European refiners, maybe even global refiners, PGM businesses that, like 70% of that market is for auto catalysts, or the manufacturers of, components like turbochargers. And we used to be in a world where it was just kind of becoming increasingly accepted that oil demand was going to peak and there wasn't going to be a need for all of that stuff I just mentioned. And now you look at some of these things like, a refining company on 7 times earnings with 9% dividend yield. Like, maybe that's not the right number if global refining product demand grows over 1 million barrels a day a year for several more consecutive years.
Rob, I wanted to ask one clarification before jumping in with a question.
Yeah, go on.
I loved your global LNG answer to Maynard. I thought it's a really interesting and differentiated viewpoint from essentially everyone else out there. And I directionally lean.
It's just going to make it more lonely when I'm wrong, isn't it, Arjun?
No, that's where money is made in the sector. So I love it. So I wanted to ask you on the solar and EV growth flattening or declining. I assume you mean the absolute growth rate will be lower in 2026 than 2025. And then is that more true in the US and Europe, where I think that is accurate? I hear a lot about growing EV sales and growing renewables in like Africa and the rest of Southeast Asia. So is that true on a global basis, your comment about solar and EVs?
Those were global numbers.
Wow. Okay.
But it's mainly linked to China, and it's mainly linked to policy. So, if you look at the US, I mean, really interesting example, as part of that big, beautiful bill, the $7,500 EV tax credit expired at the end of 3Q. And so 4Q, you no longer got that credit. And the numbers that are coming out 4Q, like initial indications, are that the quarterly run rate of EV sales in the US is down like 40%, right? So when you have a big tax incentive behind something, and then you take the incentive away, you just naturally have a slowdown. And so China has phased back incentives for both solar and EVs coming into effect in 2026. For EVs, it's actually staggered. Half of it goes away in 26, half of it goes away in 27. There's an old incentive to bring in a banger and replace it with an EV that goes away entirely in 26. And China is like 70% of global EV sales. And so that one kind of change of policy there could be enough that global EV sales are going to fall. I have it going from 22 million last year to 21 million this year. Solar is a similar story. There's just so much overcapacity in the industry, and I think the Chinese authorities recognized that the way they were incentivizing solar was just creating, even by their standards, like overcapacity. And so now there's more competitive tendering for solar projects in China, and that's also linked to a kind of maybe a sideways kind of year in that market. I think that's really last year we were at 700 gigawatts DC installations. I think this year will be about the same.
Wow, that's actually really interesting as well. My question was on when I've looked at a wide swath of energy outlooks from the IEA to the major oils, folks like yourself, wide swath of outlooks. The assumption that I always found most perplexing was on the coal demand numbers. And so I'm someone who spends a lot of time on the oil numbers. I've pushed back on the peak oil demand narratives, but I actually accept that there was, and maybe still is, a legitimate debate on the rate of oil demand growth. I think it's going to grow. Others think it might grow slower. totally legitimate debate. The one that I never understood was the coal's going to fall off a cliff assumption that still permeates most of these outlooks, whether they're net zero or otherwise. In a world where power is so critical, in a world where competitiveness in manufacturing is so critical. We were at this Goldman event, Mike and I, in a small forum yesterday, where the CFO of a U.S. coal company said current coal utilization is about low 40%. If it just went back to, I think, the historical average of low 70s, you could grow total U.S. power supply by 10% just from that alone. When I look at China's significant cost advantage on so many different manufacturing areas, there's lots of reasons for that. Amongst them is their massive coal utilization. Can you comment on coal specifically in a world where manufacturing competitiveness, AI and power growth, and these factors are clearly primary? It's not that we don't care about the environment, but if we put scrubbers and deal with SOx and NOx and traditional air pollutants, why won't coal be a major part of our energy outlook going forward? Or maybe it will.
Oh, cost. It's cost. I mean, the reason I have had coal plateauing in my numbers is that from 28, 29, 30 onwards, importing LNG is going to be cheaper than mining the marginal ton of coal in China or India. And that's kind of rooted in data. Every year, the average ton of coal mined in China gets 13 meters deeper. The seams get thinner. And the numbers that like really blew my mind last year, I was following this for a while, is the cost of building new coal mines. So if you build a new coal mine in the US or Australia, or even like Europe in theory, maybe you pay $70 per TPA. So, like you say, very cheap. But I'm seeing Chinese coal mines getting built where the cost of building the coal mine is $200 to $300 a TPA. And those numbers have just started going exponential in the last 3 to 5 years. And so, the theory around China is if this was the Permian Basin and you're seeing the CapEx cost to drill a well treble in the space of 5 years, people are like, okay, this is peaked. Like, this is really scary. And so something similar is happening. It's hard in China because you're never quite sure the quality of the data that you're getting. And then the other big thing that is coming through and could change this all again before dinner time is AI. Because I think that the numbers that you now have 40 or 50 demand coal, they call them smart coal walls, where effectively like the Boston Dynamics dog robot, you basically send that down the mine and it can go to spaces that humans can't reach, and then you don't have to worry quite so much about safety or lighting or ventilation. And so there's a whole thing there about how is AI going to transform that cost curve. But it looks like we're in that classic battle between technology and resource depletion. And as an energy analyst, what could be better as something to be looking at?
That answer blows me away, Rob. Actually, that's about as interesting an answer as I've heard on this topic. The idea that global LNG is going to be able to outcompete kind of go forward Chinese coal economics, that is fascinating, and I appreciate you sharing those perspectives. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for the question. The chance to nerd out on. I think it's such an overlooked issue, and I think you're right in what's behind the question, which is the magic mystery assumption that coal just kind of disappears. But I think there is merit behind assuming that.
So Rob, following on the same feelings that Arjun was having when you were going through that, could that mean what you just said about Chinese new mines for coal? Could that mean Chinese power prices are going to go up?
I think when I build my models for why China wins, it's not so much on power prices. It's on labor, it's on great infrastructure, it's on increasingly well, good technology underlying the things they produce. And it's kind of the absence of like shoot yourself in the foot policies where you're like, oh, hey, we make steel. We emit like 2.5 tons of CO2 per ton of steel. Let's put a carbon price in, which is going to double our steel production cost. And so I think that yeah, you probably, like everywhere that I'm looking at, are going to see higher power prices in China compared to what they might have been a few years ago. And I think power price inflation is something happening across the world, but I don't know how much it will reshape those global supply chains.
I'm pulling out. We have a technology partner, Robbie Kester. He loves to write on the table, so I'm taking a chapter from his book. But that comment, an absence of shoot yourself in the foot policies, that's a great one. But could it mean that if China gets a little more concerned about its domestic coal resource, that it, perhaps it's a little more focused on better relations with the U.S. to get LNG, or it's a little more focused on its supply chain in other areas, or it just seems like there's some interesting potential implications of that coal price forecast you just had.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's another lens on why China is the world's largest deployer of wind and solar, and also building a lot of nuclear plants at half the cost of the best Western nuclear plants. And China knows that it needs energy, and I think is doing what it does and building a lot of the things that it needs.
Maybe we could do one more commodity that China dominates, at least in consumption, which is copper.
Yeah.
Copper prices have been up a ton. Copper's a big variable. What do you think about copper?
Well, I think copper demand is going to grow about 3.5% a year over the next decade. When I look at the projects that are coming through, last year copper hit a all-time record. It was $11 a kilogram, and the marginal cost of some of these projects getting developed is like between 12 and 14. You can debate what the hurdle rate is for those, and there's all these well-worn stories in copper as well about how the resource grade depletes, and you used to mine copper that was like 1 to 3% ore grade, and now it's 0.5% ore grade, and all of that. I think with a lot of stuff, my real question about 2026 is not getting ahead of my skis. I mean, that slowdown of the growth in solar, the growth in EVs, there are a lot of commodities where, if you have slower growth in solar and slower growth in EVs, it's not great for the outlook in those commodities. And copper, you actually, I think, have it as well, a little bit on the data center side. And I'd love to mention this to you guys. Can we talk about copper use in data centers?
Please.
Which is actually not about copper use in data centers. It's about the way information propagates in the strange world we live in 2026 onwards, and the need for excellent, trusted research partners, which I think is a topic like dear to everybody on this Zoom session. So just something really interesting happened in a thing last year. NVIDIA basically decided that it had to completely change the way it does the power architecture in its data centers. And you might be thinking, where's Rob going with this? I promise this is to do with copper. And so they decide, okay, so currently at the back of every rack, there's a bus bar. And the bus bar has 54 volts. And that 54-volt bus bar is like a giant metal rod that conveys power to all of the compute trays in the rack. And there's now so much current going through that bus bar that they can't make it any bigger. You can't make it any bigger. And they say, okay, so we have to like completely change the voltage of these bus bars, because otherwise, the amount of current going through them as we move to megawatt scale racks is going to be like the equivalent of, the equivalent of a small sauna, just in resistive losses coming off of the bus bar. And they say, if we built data centers using our current architecture and the size of bus bars we would need, a gigawatt scale data center would require 500,000 tons of copper. 500,000 tons of copper for a gigawatt scale data center. That is what NVIDIA has said. And the interesting thing about that number is not that that's 1.5% of total global copper consumption for one data center. The interesting thing about that number is that it's wrong. I'm pretty sure it's a typo from NVIDIA, where they mean 500,000 pounds, not 500,000 tons. But they wrote it in like a big thing that they put out. And then a bunch of other bloggers wrote the same number. And then a bunch of other companies wrote the same number. And this same number is now like floating around in about 40 places I can find on the internet, where it's just become this thing. Like a gigawatt scale data center uses 500,000 tons of copper, 1.5% of global copper use. And I have clients writing in saying, like, have you seen the crazy copper consumption from these data centers that are getting built? And I think the whole thing is a typo. And it's a typo where they've overstated the amount by 2,200 times. And I only know this because I spent like several days trying to do the like physics of why did they say the number is so big? And I just couldn't get anywhere close to the number they said. And this just really interests me about like the kind of world we live in and how information propagates, is that you have one credible source, puts one number out into the public domain, and it gets repeated and repeated and repeated. And, you can have these like well-worn truths that everybody repeats, but nobody's actually calculated it themselves. They're just repeating it from somebody else. And I guess if there's kind of a theme to our conversation today, it's like the joy of kind of good primary analysis and busting through the myths of just repeating somebody else's number ad infinitum. And so with copper, I guess that's why I'm a little bit worried, is because some of the big drivers of copper might be slowing down a little bit this year, and we might not need to double global copper consumption just to meet this year's slate of AI data centers. Yeah.
Rob, one more from me, and I'm going to remember the joy of primary research. That's my phrase for the day. One more from me. As you kind of scan around the system and you think about the forces in the world that are causing costs to go up and the forces in the world that are helping costs to go down. In that second bucket, is it really just AI? Recognizing it has membership in the first bucket too, but how do you see the forces in the world that are going to make things, because affordability is everybody's favorite topic and it's highly politicized and it's overdone. But just when you think about the world's costs, input costs, where do you see the things that will bring down prices?
I mean, continued productivity gains in making any commodity. You can debate whether like shale was driven by data and AI or an earlier iteration thereof. But I think that the biggest one, the big kahuna is power grids, right? And that's the thing that everybody is now getting really obsessed about, the availability of power and the cost of power. And if I had quite a strong view on that, it's that flexible grids are the most important way of making grids cheaper. Remember that 2/3 of the cost you pay for the grid is not wholesale generation. It's the wires. It's moving that power from where it's produced to where it's consumed. And we run that network with an aggregate utilization factor somewhere around 40%, which means that we're building these things 2.5 times bigger than they actually need to be for the average amount of power that they're carrying. And that's because all of the power comes, on a hot summer's day when the air conditioning is running and, you need to have capacity in your system for, that nuclear plant has tripped offline. And, what I think is really going to change that is the ability to have more flexible grids. Last year, I became an EV owner, and where I live in my part of the world, we have this big nuclear plant over the water in Finland called Olkiluoto, and it runs 24 hours a day. So power is really, really cheap at night. And I charge my EV at night when power is cheap. I make my hot water in my heat pump at night when the power is really cheap. And I think, if you give people the pricing incentives, they will do that. Actually, I missed that important point. Northern Europe has like 80% penetration of time of use tariffs. So like the price I pay for my power, it is just directly a function of the wholesale power price. And it varies with the wholesale power price throughout the day. But across the whole developed world, only 35% of consumers have time of use tariff. In the US, I believe it's only 11%. And real-time pricing, which is what I have, in the US, it's only 1%, of consumers have real-time pricing. And so this is the way that you incentivize people and companies to say, hey, I'm going to move my power demand to when there's capacity in the network. And then you don't need to build so much more generation. You don't need to build so much more network. And that is the way you could integrate hundreds of gigawatts of AI into the US without having to build any new power generation, as long as you could build a more flexible system where you can curtail the non-essential loads during peak times. And I think even data centers themselves are going to find that they have more ability to be flexible in the future than they really think they do today.
Okay, Mike, you're up. But Rob, tell us what kind of car you bought. I got to ask you.
I'm a safety-obsessed European, so I bought a Volvo.
Okay. All right.
Secondhand. It had been driven for a year. It had like 6,000 miles on the odometer, but it was like 40% off the list price. I was like, wow,
Okay.
I mean, that's a distressed opportunity right there.
Fantastic. Mike?
Rob, just on piggybacking on this AI theme, it seems to me like 2025, the theme was, okay, we have to use AI in some form or fashion, right? We've heard that from some energy companies, most companies. I guess my question for you is 2026 the year where you have to show results, cost saving, efficiencies, return on that spending? And is that sort of a hockey stick type efficiency, productivity returns, gains in 26, 27, 28? I mean, it seems to me that could be the distinguisher between the winners and the losers. Maybe some thoughts on that.
I think 2026 for the companies is still a game about like who talks the best talk. I think in a way, if you go back to the early couple of years of net zero being the biggest theme in energy markets, it was the companies that talked the best talk that excited investors the most, and companies that kind of didn't have a good story about how they were going to be part of this mega trend, it got a bit left behind. And I think 2026 is going to be a year where, as a company, kind of harping on about that old mega trend that is less in people's minds might just kind of cause investors to think, guys, are you like focused on the issues of today? And I think the issues of today are companies explaining how they're going to use AI to deflate their costs and to unlock new capabilities they didn't have before, and to unlock new products that people genuinely want and will pay for. And I think the companies that tell the best stories around that, you probably don't have to deliver full results this year, but showing that you're on the path, I think is going to be the thing maybe that investors look for.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of at Goldman, we're kind of hearing that
Right.
we heard some investors talk. We had a session that we were in yesterday, and one of the feedback was, you know what, don't don't overpromise and underdeliver. But you know what, we have to see you basically talking about this AI. We have to see some tangible, realizable, in our model type results instead of you talking about it. And it just feels to me like the companies in 2026 that can show that, you know, that actual number as opposed to talking it are going to be getting some benefit. And that's kind of what we heard from some investors here. So
Right.
that's why I asked you.
Yeah.
Rob, we share a lot in common, but that joy of primary research is going to be number one. And number two may surprise you. We have both come into a secondhand Volvo recently. So my parents are 86.
Right.
And autonomous driving has not come fast enough for them. They mercifully, and I will say mercifully, gave up the wheels, and I got their Volvo. And I was going to trade it in. Like, I can't possibly drive this Volvo. But I got to tell you, it's grown on me. It's grown on my kids. And maybe we don't need to buy a new car right now. Let's see how the year goes. It's early. So we are keeping the Volvo at the moment. So I want to say I really do respect the primary research you do. And I think every area we talked about, it's not so much that you have necessarily a contrarian or different view for the sake of it, but you've actually done the detailed research and you show the assumptions. And when the assumptions change, you actually also go through it as well. So I want to say huge respects for when there's need to change your mind, you do it. And you're able to back up what people can always have different conclusions. Some of it's going to be right, some of it may not be right. But I just want to say I have a lot of respect for your fundamental process, the models. And as a primary research analyst, I am in awe of the work that you do, Rob, and it's an honor to have you as an advisory board member at Veriten. I'm going to go back to one of the first assumptions that I think we all let slide a little bit, and I'm going to ask you about it, which is the shale oil decline assumption of 700,000 barrels a day. I think that's a meaningful assumption. It is surprised to the upside this year. At Veriten, we obviously are very close to some of those companies that sort of dominate shale as well. I think if we were spending time with them and maybe doing our own analysis, we would be more in the flattish camp. One can always have a very low oil price that would get a decline, but I'm just going to say mid 50s or higher oil. I would be plus or minus flat. Maybe that's a slight decline. I don't think it's going to be a slight increase. Could you just maybe spend 2 more seconds on how you're getting a bigger decline for this year, especially after what we've seen in 2025?
Yeah. I mean, I think the simplest answer is if I take the big three shale basins and I look at the rig count today, it's like 310 units. And if I look at where that rig count was this time last year, it was like 390. So, we are at a point where oil prices averaged 70 last year. They end the year around 60. The rig count has fallen back, and it's just that it takes time for the lower activity, the lower drilling to come through there. So I think a lot of it depends on what happens next with Venezuela. I have a kind of theory about oil markets, which is that oil markets used to be dictated by OPEC policy, effectively. And now I think they get dictated by, US bullying foreign policy, in the sense that it means something serious about this. It used to be unimaginable. I think about the US consuming 20 million barrels a day, producing 10 million barrels a day. The US wanted low oil prices. And now, we're balanced, producing around 20, consuming around 20. And so, if oil prices go up or go down, the net impact on the US economy is kind of a wash. But I don't think it's beneficial for the US in many ways to have an oil price collapse, to have, oil go down to $40 a barrel. I think if oil went to 40, we'd lose like 3 million barrels a day from the big three shale basins over the next year. And then, these things are always like V-shaped, and then you'd have a massive oil price increase again in 2027, midterms. I don't know that people want, that trajectory. You don't want to see a wave of, negative economic activity, linked to a collapse in US energy production, especially at a time when you're trying to ramp gas and power data centers. You don't want to see the whipsawing of your domestic industry because it just makes investment harder when at a time when you're trying to build critical infrastructure. And so for a lot of those reasons, in a way, you could argue it makes sense for the US to say, no, we don't want to see oil prices slide too far down. And so what, is okay to do is to clamp down on the naughty producers during times where there's an excess. And you might have beef with Venezuela or Iran or Russia, and you might find that during times when otherwise oil prices might really want to go down, you see instead pressure ratchets up on the naughty producers. And so I think we're going to be in a period where kind of oil goes sideways, and you might have a decline, but it kind of depends on how much you clamp down on the naughty producers. And I guess that's why I guess I would kind of agree that maybe I might be a little pessimistic in my numbers, but I was kind of geared off oil being in that 50 to 60 range for most of 2026 when I put that in.
It's all great perspective, and it's hard to remember back, but when oil did collapse to briefly, that it's a fake number, the minus 37, but certainly very low
Right.
COVID. It was actually President Trump, who I don't know if he shares our joy of primary research, Rob. There's not a whole lot of evidence of that, but he does have an instinct, and he does have advisors. And it was actually President Trump, people remember, called for OPEC to take some action to, help us get out of those very low oil price environment, which I think is actually, in all seriousness, very much to your point that, yes, the US doesn't want $5 a gallon gasoline, but I'm not sure we want to either, and what that implies for oil prices and oil markets. And I think you're 100% right that we're probably net balanced, and too low of oil prices probably on the margin negative for the US. So,
yeah.
That was a really interesting exchange, guys. And Arjun, I'm glad you circled back to that too, because we couldn't let you go, Rob, without asking about that. Let me ask you one more as we wrap up. Every year is filled with surprises and filled with things that you just didn't see coming. And I was thinking last year on the first day of the year, I believe ish, Justin Trudeau said, "I'm out. I'm not running again." And it was like, wow, okay, things are starting to move. This year it was Venezuela. But when you think about big variables or things that might shock us or things that no one's talking about, whether they're good or bad or technology or policy or geopolitical, like, what are some of the wild cards you have on your radar as just, hey, here's a weird one, but think about this. Like, do you have anything in that bucket?
Total collapse of Russia as a state. Proliferation into smaller entities. I think the really interesting thing will be what happens after the war is over. To what extent can the snake digest the pig? And how much is Russia just a corpse being kept alive by military activity? I think if you want a wild card that will at least set your head spinning for a or two, the implications on the world and resource markets and who controls what, which would just be one of the biggest things any of us, could imagine.
Is that another? That's a great one. It's a great one.
There is a sort of darker one, which is go completely the other way. I'm on a ship to Houston, so hopefully a plane will be faster. But yeah, I think that situation, that tension is not going away. people are not going to look at what has happened in the last 4 years now and just sort of say, right, it's all over, kiss and make up. Like that is going to simmer and it will resolve one way or the other.
Do you think, Rob, this is a great place to end because, wow, that's a perfect big variable to put on our radar. Is that another way of saying a couple of things? One reason why Putin doesn't settle is the day he settles is the day he has to deal with all these internal issues. That's one way to think about it. And then the second one is it another way of saying we underestimate the stress and tension and disruption and just otherwise, societal stress that is happening internal to Russia when we think about the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I think it reminds me a lot of Libya, where you can keep people in check through punishing dissent for a very, very long time. And then when it becomes okay to have dissent, you can have a lot of dissent quite quickly. And I think, exactly like you said, the question of what happens afterwards is a question that, just the airtime devoted to that relative to the importance of it is total disconnect.
Wow. Rob, we love you. Thank you.
Back at you. Thank you. It's such a great thing to kick off the year with you guys. And, I look forward to, 2030 will be our 10th one of kicking off the year together. So, that's there. It's a good round number.
I just remembered, you're such a distinguished guest. You were also the final episode, Mike, you'll remember this, the final episode of COBT at TPH before Veriten was born. You were our guest. So you have an incredible history with us, Rob.
Well, I'm just happy you're not sick of me yet.
This is better than hosting Saturday Night Live. This is really the one you want to do. So congrats. You're better than Alec Baldwin by a long shot, actually.
Hey,
so.
And who knew Arjun had a Volvo? I mean, come on, this has been the greatest kickoff show ever.
I'm hoping we can edit that part out because anyway.
Rob, thank you. Happy New Year. All the best to your family and can't wait for what's next, buddy.
Yeah, you too. Great seeing you guys today. It's given me a real lift. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Enjoy Miami. Enjoy Las Vegas.
Enjoy Miami. I'll give you the Vegas report on Friday.
Great. Cool.
Okay.
Bye for now, guys. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.